Hello, friends, and welcome back to episode 2 of Scattered Thoughts, the minicast where we talk about whatever in the world of magic we feel like talking about. My name's Timothy, and today we are covering the topic of 3 mana rocks, specifically in EDH. So the reason I wanted to talk about this topic is because there's a lot of discourse happening in the Twitterverse and social media and with content creators about specifically 3 mana rocks in Commander and whether or not they still serve a role, whether or not they're obsolete, whether or not the prevalence of 2 mana ramp in our format is edging out the possibility that we should be playing 3 mana rocks. It seems to me that the overarching opinion that people have is that the 2 mana rocks are prevalent, they're affordable, and they're generally pretty good, and that means it's a mistake, quote unquote a mistake, to run a 3 mana rock when you could instead be running a 2 mana rock. And while that's not necessarily false, I think the use of the word mistake or telling people that it's wrong to run 3 mana rocks is where things get a little bit muddied. So I'm here to kind of be a 3 mana rock apologist for the day and tell you that, hey, if you saw a 3 mana rock that you find interesting for your Commander deck, guess what? You can play it. Nothing's obsolete in Commander. That's the glory of Commander, is you get to play what you want to play. So if you see something that speaks to you, you should definitely play it. And if it turns out that it's not powerful enough or it's not doing the thing that you wanted it to do, well, then you can look for an alternative. Now, I do want to be very clear with our language here and clear about what we're talking about, because it seems that people aren't necessarily having the same conversation, or at least aren't looking at the same power levels of deck when they talk about this. I see a lot on Twitter where somebody will suggest a 3 mana rock and say something along the lines of, why don't people play this more often? And the responses usually boil down to, well, why would you play that 3 mana rock when you could play Arcane Signet or Thought Vessel or Mind Stone or Guardian Idol or Fellwar Stone or any of the really good 2 mana rocks? And they're not wrong. The 2 mana rocks are almost always going to be better at ramping than the 3 mana rocks. Obviously, you get to play it down on turn 2, you skip to turn 4 instead of playing your rock on turn 3 and skipping to turn 5. The earlier in the game that you can, quote unquote, skip a turn ahead, the more likely it is that you're going to get an advantage and push ahead in that game. The thing that I want to clarify here is the question that you should be asking yourself if you are having this same sort of dilemma between cutting a 2 mana rock for a 3 mana rock or vice versa. And that question is, what is your goal with making your deck? Are you trying to optimize your deck? If you're going for optimization, what I basically mean is you're trying to pick the best version of any given card or effect that you know you're slotting into your deck. So you know if you have a slot open for a ramp spell, you want the best possible ramp spell that you have access to. And of course, we're not talking budgety here today because that's going to throw a wrench in a lot of people's plans. But are you trying to optimize your deck? Are you looking to play CEDH, or are you just casually playing at your LGS with your friends? Are you looking to make your deck top tier? Are you probably entering a tournament with it and you want to win? Or are you just trying to sit down and have casual games of Commander? Depending on your answer to that question, that's going to answer whether or not you should be playing the 3 mana rocks or the 2 mana rocks. My general stance throughout this episode is going to be that 3 mana rocks are technically outclassed by the 2 mana rocks, but only in the sense that you're trying to optimize your deck. If you don't care about optimization and you're just trying to play Commander with friends, then you don't need to worry about having the best possible option for each given effect in your deck, which means you free yourself up to play slightly more expensive mana rocks, so long as they actually do something. I do want to put a little bit of emphasis on that caveat that I just mentioned. Your 3 mana rocks can't just add mana. Let's use the baseline mana rock of Manolith. This is a 3 colorless artifact. It taps for any color of mana, and that is it. Obviously, if you played Magic for more than a couple weeks, you know that Manolith is obsolete. There are other versions of cards that are just as cheap and just as bulky that do the same thing but offer a bonus on top of that. There are tons of strictly better versions of Manolith. However, to justify running those strictly better versions over a cheaper mana rock, they usually have to provide some sort of extra advantage. And I'm going to go over a whole list of mana rocks today, specifically 3 mana rocks that I find to be quite unique or powerful or interesting that I think just disproves the idea that 3 mana rocks are obsolete. There are plenty of them out there that do just enough to justify running a more expensive rock over a 2 mana rock. And again, this is under the assumption that we're not necessarily interested in optimizing our deck, or we're not trying to build a CEDH deck or something along those lines. I also want to be clear that I'm not bringing fast mana into the question at all here. Fast mana, in quotes, generally refers to mana rocks that generate more mana than it takes to actually cast them. So your Soul Rings, your Mana Vaults, your Mana Crypts, things of that nature that you play and you actually net mana to the turn you play them. I'm not interested in having a conversation about those. That's not really factoring into the 2 mana versus 3 mana rock debate, because obviously they're the best options out there. And again, you're looking to optimize if you're playing cards like Mana Crypt and Mana Vault and things like that. So let's go ahead and hone in on some of these 3 mana artifacts that I think do pull their weight. These mana rocks that do unique things or offer extra mana or really justify themselves over a 2 mana counterpart. We will also talk about a couple of the 3 mana artifacts that I've seen come up in conversation that I do think are quite bad, but we'll get to those at the end of the video, and there's a lot less of those to talk about. So, 3 mana artifacts that you should consider running in EDH that do definitely pull their weight, despite having some competition with the 2 mana ramp. First off is a Commander staple that I hear a lot of debate about. That's Commander Sphere. This is 3 colorless mana for an artifact that taps for any color in your commander's color identity, so it does the command tower thing, and you can sacrifice it to draw a card. Notably, you do not have to tap it to activate that draw ability. If it's going to get destroyed, you just go ahead and cash it in for a card at any time. You can also do that later in the game. You have plenty of mana. You go ahead and trade it in for a card. So this is the perfect example of a strictly better Manolith. It does exactly what Manolith does, but it has an extra ability tacked on. And I find that Commander Sphere actually gets the job done in plenty of different decks. I actually play Commander Sphere in more than half of my decks. The only decks I tend to leave it out of are monocolored decks because there are usually better options there. But being able to trade in your mana rock for a card at no cost is great, especially when you don't have to use that on an activated ability. So compare that to something like Mind Stone. Mind Stone is 2 colorless mana for a mana rock that taps for colorless, and you can pay 1 and tap it to sacrifice it and draw a card. Again, same concept of a mana rock that's going to accelerate you. Mind Stone doesn't fix you the way that Commander Sphere does, but it is cheaper, and you get to cash it in later on down the line when you don't necessarily need the card. There's a lot of other cards in this same vein. Think Hedron Archive or Dreamstone Hedron, I think is the name of it. Plenty of mana rocks that cash themselves in for cards later on down the line. Commander Sphere does the job quite well here, and the part that I really like about this is people are running way more artifact wraths these days. Things like Bane of Progress, Austere Command, Wave of Vitriol, Vandal Blast, these effects that just destroy all the artifacts on board. So being able to cash in your artifact, even if it's tapped to draw a card, yes, you're still going to lose your Commander Sphere, but you do get to replace it, and you're not necessarily down on cards that way. So Commander Sphere definitely gets the nod for me as a card that I usually start with if I'm playing 2-3 colors. Maybe if you're in a heavy ramp deck and you have a bunch of green-based ramp like Kodama's Reaches and Cultivates and stuff like that, you're probably going to be less interested in these 3 mana rocks. But outside of green-based ramp decks, I think cards like this usually get the job done. Another one in this same vein is Skyclave Relic. This is a strictly better version of Darksteel Ingot, which is 3 colorless mana for an artifact that taps for any color, and it also happens to be indestructible. It doesn't do anything else. Your upside is the fact that it's indestructible, but the same way Commander Sphere kind of helps you mitigate the effects of a Wrath on your board, or like an mass artifact destructive effect, Darksteel Ingot kind of saves itself from that as well, and that is upside in a lot of different games. Now, Skyclave Relic came around in Zendikar Ryzen, and it iterated on this with a better version. It has Kicker for 3 mana, and if you pay the Kicker cost, you actually get 2 copies of the Skyclave Relic as well, meaning you get 3 mana rocks for 6 total mana. So all in all, you have that same option of playing your 3 mana rock and accelerating and fixing your mana, but if you happen to draw later in the game, you get an extra mana boost off of it, and I think that definitely serves it well, especially given that all of these copies are going to be indestructible and will survive most of the Wrath type effects that are targeted towards artifacts. Another newish card on this list is the Celestis. I'm not sure if people have caught on to how good this card is yet because it has a lot of the day-night text, so it makes you feel as a new player like you're only supposed to play this in a werewolf-style deck or something that cares about night and day switching, but it is quite good. The Celestis came out in Midnight Hunt. It is a 3-mana artifact that taps for any color of mana, and whenever night switches to day or day switches to night, you get to loot and gain a life. It also introduces the day-night cycle and has an activated ability that lets you force it to switch from day to night, so you can proc the loot ability on your own. But the thing that's really cool about this card is it does what you want from a mana rock. Obviously, it's tapping and fixing your mana, same as any of these other Manalith variants. But you get these free loots and life gain triggers throughout the course of a game. The Celestis gives you a little bit more control over the day-night switching in a typical Commander game. You have the activated ability, which lets you just force the action. Plus, if you're in the type of deck that can play at instant speed and interact on your opponent's turns, maybe you have flash cards, Vidalcan Orrery, things like that, you can always just pass the turn, and it'll switch to night. You'll get your loot, you'll gain a life, and you'll still be able to cast your spells, even using the Celestis for mana. It is a legendary artifact that doesn't really matter. It means you can't copy it and stuff like that, but that's probably not a big factor in whether or not we're interested in this card. There are some decks that actually care about legendary permanents, so maybe Captain Sisay, which can fetch up legendary permanents, will be happy to have a copy of the Celestis. Still, I think if you're on the search for a 3-mana accelerant, you should be on the lookout for this card. It's fairly cheap right now. I could foresee it going up in price over time because it is a nice utility card. It just gives you this great effect to have on board as a passive ability on top of the mana rock that you're already playing it for. Nice little package that I think hasn't quite caught on with a bunch of Magic players yet. It is fairly new, but I expect you'll be seeing the Celestis a lot more down the line. We just mentioned Captain Sisay, so I wanted to give a nod here to an older card called Honor Worn Shaku. It's a 3-mana artifact that taps for colorless mana. This one does not actually tap for colored mana, but taps for colorless, and you can tap a legendary permanent you control to untap the Shaku. Now what that means is it essentially converts your legendary permanents into extra mana. You tap a legendary permanent, you untap the Shaku, you tap the Shaku for mana, rinse and repeat. In decks with heavy numbers of legendaries, especially legendary enchantments and artifacts and even planeswalkers, since they're all legendary now, you can basically convert those all into extra mana. I find the planeswalker thing to be quite cool. I do run this in a Captain Sisay deck, and it's really nice to be able to tap your planeswalkers, which doesn't really hurt you in any way, shape, or form, to untap the Shaku and get extra mana out of it. So there are turns where you can generate tons of extra mana off the Shaku, which you wouldn't be able to do with normal mana rocks, although you are limited to colorless mana here. I'm sure there are also pretty obvious infinite combos that I don't really think about with this card. It is able to generate a ton of extra mana in a turn when you have a bunch of legends, and the good news is you're talking about Commander. Pretty much everything is legendary now. So it's a neat little card to be on the lookout for. It is a little bit older than most of the cards we're going to talk about today. I'm not sure what the price is. I picked mine up a long time ago, but it is a sweet card to keep in mind if you're running a deck with a bunch of legendary permanents that aren't necessarily legendary lands or creatures or things like that. And speaking of tapping and untapping, there's also a new card from Battle for Baldur's Gate called Patriarch's Seal that I think is going to catch on quite a bit if it hasn't already. Patriarch's Seal is 3 colorless mana for an artifact, taps for any color of mana, so you've got your baseline Manalith, but you can also pay a mana and tap it to untap a legendary creature you control. This one's a bit more obvious in its applications. If you have a commander or just creatures in general in your deck that have activated abilities that require them to tap, Patriarch's Seal is a card that you're probably interested in. I am running this currently in my Baba Lysaga deck, which is also from Baldur's Gate. Basically, if you have a tap ability on a commander, you're always looking for ways to either accelerate that with haste or ways to untap and be able to reuse that ability multiple times per turn, and Patriarch's Seal gives you that ability while also just serving as a mana rock until you need to use that ability. It's a pretty powerful card. It's not limited to legendary, so you can use it on your Llanowar tribes and your creatures that generate a ton of extra mana. I've seen people use this with Arcanus the Omnipotent. It's a hard one to say. Couple other things like that. Anything that taps to do something especially useful. Patriarch's Seal basically lets you pay a mana to activate that ability again with some extra hoops. It's quite powerful. I expect this to be one of the more popular mana rocks moving forward as well. A couple artifacts here in the category of manoliths that can generate additional mana. One of my personal favorites is Coalition Relic. Coalition Relic is 3 colorless mana for an artifact, taps for any color of mana. It also has a secondary activated ability where you can tap it to put a counter on it, and then at the beginning of your first main phase, your pre-combat main phase, you remove all of the counters from it, and you get mana equal to the number of counters you removed. So it kind of lets you store up the mana you would use on one turn and get that the following turn. Obviously, if you tap it to put a charge counter on it, you're not able to tap it for mana that turn, but it will untap the following turn where you can tap it for mana plus give you that extra mana. So it generates extra mana over the course of multiple turns, but you can still use it as just a normal mana rock. Coalition Relic used to be a really expensive card, but it has been reprinted, I think, a couple times now. I know it was reprinted in Masters 25, and I want to say it was in Time Spiral Remastered as well, so it's gone way, way down in price. Still a little bit more expensive than just, a bulk mana rock, but I think it's an affordable card now. And I highly recommend this for decks that have multicolor requirements, maybe your 5-color commanders and stuff like that. Coalition Relic is going to do a really good job of giving you multiple colors of mana during the same turn, while also potentially ramping you ahead. Sometimes you have those turns where you play your mana rock on turn 3 and you don't have a 1-drop or anything to do, so the extra mana you're getting off of it goes to waste that turn. Coalition Relic gives you a nice little way to circumvent that. You play it on turn 3 and you just tap it for the charge counter, and then on the following turn, if you play a land, you have 6 mana available to you, so it gives you this nice little extra spurt of mana every other turn if that's the way you want to use it. And you can always default to just using it as a normal mana rock if you don't need the extra spurt of mana. Another personal favorite of mine is Manascape Refractor. This card is actually dirt cheap for what it does. It's less than $1, and it has quite a powerful ability. It is a 3-colorless mana rock. This one actually enters the battlefield tapped, and it doesn't actually have a tap ability on it, so it doesn't say tap to add 1 mana of any color. Instead, it has a static ability that says it has all activated abilities of lands on the battlefield. So obviously that means if they're basics or they're lands that tap for mana on the battlefield, it's going to have those abilities. It doesn't necessarily fix you, but it usually taps for 1 of any color. For example, if you're playing a 3-color deck, let's just say Jund, and you have a red, green, and black land on the battlefield, this is going to tap for red, green, and black. But if you need blue or white or whatever, for whatever reason, you'll have to rely on your opponent's lands to be able to tap for those. The cool thing here, though, is that it has all activated abilities, not just mana abilities. So what that means is, while in addition to picking up super powerful mana abilities, for example, this will have the activated ability of an opponent's Gaia's Cradle, this will have the activated ability of a Cabal Coffers that an opponent has just put on the battlefield. It'll have any activated abilities of lands that draw a card. Things like Maze of Ith, if your opponent has one of those sitting around, you will also have access to that ability. Basically, it just has a very versatile effect, and there are games where this won't actually do anything special. People are just playing basics or duels and stuff like that, but even then, it kind of does the Manolith thing with the option of sometimes picking up really crazy good abilities off of the other lands your opponents will be playing, or even the lands that you play. The downside to this one, obviously, is that it comes in tapped, so you can't do super explosive things the turn that it comes into play, but it is a very unique effect for a 3-mana artifact, and like I said, it's less than $1, so if you're looking for a backup copy of your Cabal Coffers or your Gaia's Cradle, because you need a second Gaia's Cradle in your deck for some reason, this might be a card worth looking into, and I've noticed that sometimes it just does pretty cool things. Sometimes it picks up a man-land ability where it can turn into a creature and stuff like that, and people don't necessarily expect it to be able to do that. Pretty cool effect for these sorts of mana rocks that we're talking about. There's also a subcategory of mana rocks that aren't colorless. They've started making a few more of these days. They have colored mana requirements, but usually have an activated ability or some sort of bonus ability that's on color. That means they're going to be a little more restricted in the decks that you can play them in, but they do give you extra benefits on top of just tapping for mana, which at the beginning of this episode we said is what your 3-mana rocks need to do to be justifiable picks for your deck. Midnight Clock from Eldraine is 2 and a blue for an artifact that taps for only blue mana. Every upkeep, it gets a counter, and then once it hits the 12th counter, you shuffle your hand back. I think you shuffle your graveyard back as well, and you draw 7 cards. It also has an activated ability where you can pay 2 and a blue to put another counter on it. I think they're called clock counters. I'm not 100% sure, but you get the idea. The clock strikes midnight after 12 activations or 12 turns. You get a fresh new hand. The awkward thing, obviously, is that the Midnight Clock goes away, so you actually lose out on the extra mana, but you do get to potentially draw a huge number of extra cards off of your mana rock, and that's a pretty explosive secondary effect to have on your clock. It is worth noting as well that this triggers on every single player's turn, so if you play it on your turn in a 4-person game, by the time it gets back to your turn, it'll have 4 counters on it once it triggers on your turn as well. Which means after 3 turn cycles, you get to just loot away your hand and draw a new hand. It's a pretty powerful effect. I saw some people bad-mouthing this as not particularly playable. I don't know where they're coming from. I think that's a profoundly strong ability to have tied to something that's accelerating you for the extra turns. It is nice, too, that you can use the extra mana from the Midnight Clock to empty your hand out before you get to the 12th hour. That way you have an empty hand and you're drawing or netting as many cards as possible. Crowded Crypt is one of the newer ones. I think this was printed in the Wilhelm deck or Wilhelt deck. It is 2 and a black for an artifact that taps for black mana. Whenever a creature you control dies, you put a counter on it, and for 6 mana, I believe it's 4 black, you can tap it and sacrifice it to make a 2/2 decayed zombie for each counter on it. Again, very similar in concept to what Midnight Clock is doing. It's a mana rock that's restricted to its own color, but it gives you this really big after effect as the game goes on. It stores up counters as your creatures are dying. Obviously, you're most interested in a deck that's doing some sort of zombie thing, so you're getting zombies off of the Crowded Crypt. And then you get to convert all of those counters as your creatures die into an army of decayed zombies. They are decayed zombies, so they'll die when they attack for the first time. They can't block, but that's all coming from your mana rock. Compare this to something like Army of the Damned, which is 8 mana to make 13 2/2 zombies. Crowded Crypt, usually going to be better if you have creatures dying throughout the course of a game, because it's going to add mana while doing the thing, and you're still going to get your army of zombies eventually. Again, fits that mold perfectly of mana rock that accelerates you. Doesn't necessarily fix you, but zombie decks, I can't imagine care about the fixing that often. But it does accelerate you, and it gives you a big bonus towards the end of the game. My favorite of these 3, however, is the Cursed Mirror. This is 2 and a red for an artifact that taps for red mana. And when it enters the battlefield, you may have it become a copy of another creature until end of turn. Now, it enters the battlefield and then it becomes a copy of that creature, so it misses out on enter the battlefield triggers, but you do get attack triggers. So if you happen to turn this into your opponent's Kozilek, surprise, Kozilek Hasty for 3 mana, and then it turns into a mana rock end of turn. It does get any sort of static abilities. It just becomes a copy of another creature until end of turn. It gains haste, so it can attack right away. It's just a nice little effect to have attached to your mana rock. It's a little more restrictive in its application. It only taps for red. Again, it's not a manolith variant necessarily, as it is a mono red accelerant, but in decks that care about copying creatures or decks that just want acceleration and are looking for unique effects, I think this is a pretty sweet option to have. It does get that surprise factor from the opponent. Obviously, hasty creatures always do this, but when you're hasting out your opponent's creatures or copying their creatures, it's like an extra little surprise. I highly recommend this one. It is worth noting that Cursed Mirror is slowly creeping up in price. It's been out for a little while. I can't remember the exact deck that it was printed in, Commander deck from a couple years ago, but I have noticed there's a tiny trend in this card increasing in price. So if you're interested in this sort of effect, I suggest trying to pick it up sooner than later, because it is a very powerful mana rock, and I think people are going to be interested in this down the line. Now, on top of those being some of my favorite 3 mana rocks that are worth consideration in Commander decks, I do think it's worth noting that there are plenty of thematic mana rocks that fit certain types of decks that you wouldn't necessarily just put in any deck. Most of the ones that I've named here are pretty generic. Obviously, there's things like Patriarch's Seal, which you want in a deck that has creatures with tap abilities. There's Honor-Worn Shaku, which really needs legendaries to do anything. But most of them, the Celestis, Commander Sphere, Collision Relic, if you're just interested in playing a 3-mana rock, these are generically good and go in pretty much any deck where you would want that sort of effect. There are other cards, though. For example, let's look at Pristine Talisman. This is 3 colorless mana for an artifact that taps for colorless mana, and then you gain a life as part of the mana ability. That's a perfectly fine mana rock to put in a deck that cares about life gain. I've seen people with Karlov decks or Oloro decks or Vito, Thorn of the Dusk Rose decks that play Pristine Talisman because it gives them a life gain trigger, which triggers a lot of their stuff, and I think that's perfectly fine. It's not a hyper powerful card. It's not even necessarily better than Arcane Signet or Mind Stone or something like that, but it does something thematic for the deck that people are trying to build, and I think that's what you need to be looking for. There's a ton of stuff like this out there. For example, I played Azorius Keyrune in my Fly-In Matters deck. This is a 3-mana artifact that taps for white or blue, and you can pay some amount of mana to turn it into like a 2/1 bird until end of turn. Obviously, that's not a very generically useful 3-mana artifact, but that deck cared about flyers, it cared about birds, it cared about evasive creatures. I thought it was a perfectly fine addition to that deck, and while a little bit gimmicky, it was a cool micro-synergy card to find in my pile of cards that fit into a deck. Again, the glory of Commander being that most cards you can find a place for, even if other people don't necessarily see the merit of those cards. The same is true of a lot of these dragon artifacts that we've been seeing. Dragons just has a plethora of 3-mana artifacts. There's Dragon's Horde. There's also the new orbs that came out in Battle for Baldur's Gate, so like the Carnelian Orb and the Jade Orb and whatever the other one's called. Those are highly specific to dragon decks, obviously, but they get the job done in those decks. There are things like the Cyclone Mana Rocks from Ikoria, which are really good in any deck that cares about Cyclone. If you play Gavi, the Nest Warden, I believe the name of the card is, the Jeskai legendary that cares about Cyclone, sure, you're going to go ahead and play the Cyclone Mana Rock that taps for blue, red, and white. The Ralgrin Crystal, I believe it's called, you'll play that in that deck over something like Commander Sphere some amount of the time because it does what your commander wants to do. It does what your deck wants to do. I think these are the type of things you want to be looking for. Thematic mana rocks, there's a ton of them out there that I'm not mentioning today. Or generically powerful mana rocks that give you the mana that you're looking for on turn 3, while also giving you some sort of added benefit. Obviously, you don't want mana rocks that do nothing but just tap for an extra mana on turn 3, because those just don't justify themselves these days. I do have to agree with people that those sorts of manolith style things, there are obelisks out there from Shards of Alara, they don't really do what you need to be doing. You can always get your hands on a Commander Sphere, or you can go spend $1 on a Manascape Refractor and get a much more powerful effect for your deck without necessarily having to optimize for competitive builds or anything like that. Now, before we go for the day, I do want to bring up a couple mana rocks that people like to bring up as staples or things that people like that I think are actually quite bad or not great options. We'll go ahead and start with the one that kind of inspired me to do this episode, and that is Decanter of Endless Water. This is 3 colorless mana, another Baldur's Gate edition. It taps for any color of mana, and it has the static ability that you have no maximum hand size. So think Thought Vessel, which is 2 mana for the same effect, but only taps for colorless. But this one's 3 mana, and in exchange for paying an extra mana to be able to cast it, it does tap for any color of mana. Now, the reason I don't really like this card is because I've seen that text of not having a maximum hand size matter so little compared to how often people think that they need that sort of effect in their decks, that I would just rather run another one of these artifacts that we've mentioned today, unless I'm in a deck that I know is going to be drawing a ton of cards or discarding a bunch of cards. This is kind of a topic for another day, but Reliquary Tower and that sort of effect, the no maximum hand size effect, is a lot less useful than people give it credit for. I've seen people say that they put Reliquary Tower in every single deck, and I used to do the same thing, but when you play games of Magic with Reliquary Tower, you do kind of realize after a certain point that it's not doing anything. There are so many games where you just never have more than 7 cards in hand, and unless your deck is specifically designed to draw a ton of cards, you don't really need this sort of effect. Now, I want to put people to the test with this because there are people who always give me backlash about me saying Reliquary Tower is not a staple card. The next time you play Reliquary Tower in just your average deck, Again, not a deck that's specifically designed to be drawing millions of cards, but just a regular deck. I want you to count the number of times that Reliquary Tower has stopped you from discarding a card. And I would venture to say that it's a lot lower than you would expect. I think you'll go through entire games where you never have to go to discard, and your Reliquary Tower could have been something a little bit more useful for your mana base, or a different utility land, or something just a little bit more helpful. And with that being my stance on Reliquary Tower, I think that does translate over to the Decanter of Endless Water. I just don't see the text no maximum hand size being that big of a boon for most decks, to the point where I think this is a mana rock worth running over some of the other options I mentioned today, assuming I have access to them, of course. Now, this is all obviously with a big asterisk next to it. If you're playing a deck that needs tons and tons of mana and draws a bunch of cards and is obviously going to be drawing 5, 6, 7 cards per turn, then yes, you're interested in the no maximum hand size clause and you'll consider this as a mana rock. But just as a random option, you're putting together a new commander deck. You're like, hey, I've got an opening here for a 3 mana rock. I think this would be really far down my list of options, unless I knew that I absolutely wanted that effect in my deck. Another option here, another one that I get a lot of flack about when I bring it up in certain commander circles, is Chromatic Lantern. This might be my biggest soapbox card in all of Commander. I think Chromatic Lantern is actually quite poor. And while, yes, it is a strictly better manalith, I think the effect it has on games is so often the same thing that manalith is doing that it kind of tricks people into thinking it's this hyper powerful commander card. Now, if you're running a 4 or 5 color deck and you don't have premium mana fixing, you don't have a bunch of shocks and fetches and triomes and stuff like that, and you have a copy of Chromatic Lantern, look, I'm not here to harsh your mellow. Go ahead and play your Chromatic Lantern. It'll make tapping easier. But I want to put you to another test here, the same way I would with Reliquary Tower. The next time you play Chromatic Lantern in, let's say, your 3-color deck, I want you to take note of the times that you were able to cast a spell that you would have otherwise not been able to cast if your Chromatic Lantern was just a manalith instead. I think the fact that Chromatic Lantern provides a rock that taps for any colorless mana, or any color of mana, is exactly what you end up getting out of that card, and the fact that it gives you perfect mana fixin' usually doesn't matter. Most of the time when you need fixin' of some sort, you really only need that one extra mana rock that can tap for anything, and Chromatic Lantern already does that without altering what your other lands can tap for. There are times where you get to double spell or cast like a super mana intensive spell like an ultimatum or something like that, and Chromatic Lantern will help you do that. But mana bases are pretty easy to put together these days. There's a lot of mana fiction options that are very cheap, and I think Chromatic Lantern's universal mana fixing ability is a lot less useful than people give it credit for. I wouldn't give it that hard of a time if it wasn't still a somewhat expensive card. I think the cheapest versions of Chromatic Lantern still go for like $8 or $9, and the effect that it has is not significantly better than what you get off just a normal mana rock like Manalith. So I'll step down from my soapbox for Chromatic Lantern right now. I've got a lot more I could say about it. Maybe we should put that to a science and see if we can test out how often Chromatic Lantern actually helps people cast spells that another mana rock wouldn't be able to cast. But from my experience is Commander Sphere gets the job done just well enough, even in the 5-color decks, unless I have super highly mana-intensive cards. The last category of cards I want to talk about before wrapping up here are the mana dorks, the creatures that tap for mana. And here I'm talking about kind of the dorky ones where their whole function is a 3-mana creature that taps for some amount of mana. Examples of this are Palladium Mirror, which is 3 colorless mana for a 2/2 that taps for 2 colorless mana. Something like Alloy Mirror, which is 3 mana for, I think, a 1/2 that taps for any color of mana. These creatures that do the same exact thing that the mana rocks are doing, just in my opinion, are not worth it. They're too easy to kill. They get swept up in normal board wipes, which everybody plays. And I find that if you draw them later in the game, they have no real added utility outside of being a mana dork. I just don't think the juice is worth the squeeze, which I guess is a phrase we're going to use in every episode of this show. But I would generally stay away from those unless I have some sort of creature-heavy component to my deck, or I care about casting creatures or having bodies on board. If they're not doing anything thematic for the deck, I find that they're not super useful. So that's all I have to say on the matter here. The bottom line here is no, 3-mana rocks are not obsolete. There are versions of 3-mana rocks that are by definition obsolete. So again, I keep mentioning Manolith. I've mentioned these obelisks. These cards are technically obsolete in the sense that there are strictly better versions out there that are just as expensive or inexpensive that you could be running instead. So if you can get your hands on those, go ahead and play those instead. But the bottom line here is we're talking about casual Commander most of the time. If somebody online says, hey, I really like this card, please don't approach that from the perspective of, well, you could be playing this much better card instead because it's just strictly better. If it's not actually strictly better, don't say it's strictly better. Let people play the cards that they want to play, and you, the deck builder, should be happy to play whatever cards strike your fancy. You should, at the same time, recognize that, yes, the 2-mana mana rocks, the Thought Vessels, the Felwar Stones, things of that nature, they are generally better, but if you're not focused on optimization, you don't necessarily need to play the universally better version of every effect in your deck. You can play something that's a little bit more expensive, but has a little bit of extra utility to it. Alright, I hope that maybe you've discovered a new mana rock that you're interested in picking up or checking out. I would like to hear if I missed any very important 3-mana rocks, specifically the 3-mana ones that you think have really served you well in Commander. Feel free to comment below with any of those that I might have missed. Again, this was not meant to be an exhaustive list, just a bunch that I've had success with or found to be worth their while over potential 2-mana rocks. And I hope that this has been a good discussion for people to kind of get their gears working in terms of how to think about their mana rocks or what their 3-mana rocks need to be doing. Before we go for the day, I want to remind you that Jank Diver Gaming, where you are watching this video, is a cube-related community. So if you're interested in joining us for Arena Cubing, there will be a link to our Discord wherever you're watching this video. You can subscribe to this channel for more episodes of Scattered Thoughts, and if you have recommendations for topics or show episodes, feel free to comment below with those as well. With all that being said, thanks for hanging out. This has been episode 2 of Scattered Thoughts. My name is Timothy with Jank Diver Gaming, and I will see you all next time.